The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, which was already strange enough. Vivienne Okafor had not spoken to her ex-husband in 2 years. Not since the divorce was finalized in a downtown Ottawa courthouse, on a gray November afternoon, the kind of day where the sky sits so low it feels like a ceiling pressing down. She had walked out of that building alone, her coat buttoned wrong, her lawyer saying something she didn't fully hear. She had taken the bus home because her car was in the shop, and she had sat in the back row and looked out the window at the canal, and felt, for the first time in 4 years, like she could breathe. So when the envelope arrived, cream-colored, heavy stock, her name written in calligraphy she recognized as catered, she stood at her kitchen counter for a long moment before opening it. Mr. Desmond Okafor and Miss Priya Nair request the pleasure of your company at their wedding celebration. Vivienne read it twice. Then she set it down on the counter next to her coffee and went to the window. Outside, the maple on her front lawn was just starting to turn. October in Ottawa came early and came hard, and she had always loved that about this city. The way seasons announced themselves without apology. She picked up the envelope again. There was a handwritten note on the back of the inner card, in Desmond's tidy block lettering. Vivienne, I hope you'll come. It would mean a great deal. Her assistant, a young man named Tobias, found her still standing there when he arrived at 9 for their morning debrief. He looked at the card, looked at her face, and said nothing for a moment. You're not actually thinking about going, he finally said. Vivienne folded the card and slid it back into the envelope. I haven't decided. He's inviting you to watch him marry someone else. I'm aware of what a wedding is, Tobias. He pressed his lips together and set his laptop on the table. They had work to do. She had a board meeting in 3 days, 2 acquisition calls before noon, and a site visit in Gatineau on Thursday. Vivienne Okafor did not have time to think about invitations from her ex-husband. But she thought about it anyway. She had met Desmond at 26, at a fundraising gala for a local arts organization, where she had been volunteering as an event coordinator. He had been the kind of man who took up space confidently, tall, well-dressed, funny in a way that made everyone around him lean in. He worked in commercial real estate. He had a name that opened doors in Ottawa's business community. And he knew it, and he didn't try to hide that he knew it. Vivienne had been charmed. She'd been young enough to confuse confidence with depth. They married when she was 29. By 31 she understood the difference. Desmond was not a cruel man. That was what made it complicated. He didn't shout or demean or dismiss her in ways she could point to clearly and say, there, that is the problem. It was subtler than that. It was the way he talked about her work at dinner parties. Viv does some consulting, keeps herself busy, when she was already running her own boutique investment advisory firm with 6 employees and a client list that included 3 of the largest Indigenous-owned enterprises in Eastern Ontario. It was the way he introduced her to his colleagues as his wife first, with her name and afterthought. It was the way he had once, during a rare argument, said, you know, I've always been the one who actually understands how money works in this city. She had let that one sit. She hadn't answered. She'd gone to bed, stared at the ceiling, and thought about the client she was advising that week. A Métis-owned construction company that was quietly positioning itself to become one of the largest infrastructure contractors in the province. She had thought about what she knew and what she'd built and what she was still building. And she had thought about the fact that Desmond had no idea. Not because she had hidden it. She hadn't hidden anything. She'd talked about her work, her clients, her strategy. He simply hadn't listened with the kind of attention that retains information. He had nodded and changed the subject and assumed, in the way people assume things about the people they've already decided to understand, that he already knew everything he needed to know about what his wife did and what she was worth. The divorce had been civil, no children. The house in Westboro went to him. She hadn't wanted it. She had taken her business and her books and her grandmother's dining table and moved to a row house in Hintonburg that she'd bought in cash. She had not looked back. She decided to go. She wasn't sure she could explain it fully, even to herself. Partly it was curiosity, a clean, almost clinical curiosity about what it would feel like to sit in a room where she had once been the central figure and now was simply a guest. Partly it was something quieter than that, a desire to close a door she hadn't fully closed. To walk into that room as who she was now, not who she'd been when she left it. She called her friend Audra, who had been her closest confidant through the divorce and who had a gift for plain speech that Vivienne relied on. He wants you there to watch him be happy, Audra said. Maybe, men like Desmond don't invite ex-wives to their weddings out of goodwill. He wants you to see what you lost. That's one interpretation. It's the correct interpretation. Vivienne smiled. I know, and you're going anyway. I'm going anyway. There was a pause. Then Audra laughed low and knowing. Fine, but wear something devastating. Vivienne wore a deep burgundy dress, clean-lined and understated in the way that only works when the person wearing it needs nothing from the room. She wore the earrings her mother had left her. She did not bring a date. The wedding was held at a restored heritage property on the edge of Gatineau Park, a venue Vivienne knew, as it turned out, better than Desmond probably realized. She had advised one of the investors in the property's restoration 3 years prior. A quiet file she had never mentioned at dinner, because Desmond had been talking about a colleague's golf game and the moment had passed. She arrived alone, checked her coat, and was greeted at the door by a hostess with a seating chart. "Okafor," Vivienne said. The hostess searched the list, found it. There was a brief hesitation, so slight most people would have missed it, before she smiled and said, "Right this way." The table was at the back of the reception hall. Not the worst table, technically. It wasn't near the kitchen or behind a column, but it was the table where you put the people you'd had to invite but weren't sure what to do with. A few of Desmond's distant cousins. A childhood friend of Priya's who had flown in from Vancouver and clearly didn't know anyone. A man named Clifford who seemed to be there in some professional capacity and spent the first 20 minutes checking his phone. Vivienne sat down, accepted a glass of sparkling water from a server, and looked around the room. It was a beautiful venue. She would give him that. The ceilings were original timber, the lighting was warm, and someone had done the flowers well. White and sage green, restrained without being cold. The kind of wedding that had been planned carefully, without the excess that makes a room feel like it's trying too hard. Priya Nair was stunning. Vivienne watched her move through the space before the ceremony began and thought, good for her. She meant it, genuinely. Priya had the look of someone who was exactly where she wanted to be, and Vivienne felt nothing complicated about that. Desmond, when she spotted him across the room, looked the same as he always had. That easy confidence, that comfortable certainty about his place in any gathering. He caught her eye once, nodded. A brief, careful nod that said, "I see you, I invited you. I'm glad you're here, but I'm not coming over," and then turned back to his groomsmen. Vivienne looked back at her water glass, the afterthought table, she thought, not with bitterness, just with a clear, almost amused recognition of what was being communicated. The ceremony was lovely. The vows were specific in the way that good vows are, full of private references and knowing laughter from the guests who understood the inside of the joke. Vivienne sat in the third-to-last row and listened and felt with some surprise that she was genuinely moved by it. Not by any sense of loss. By the simple human weight of two people deciding to build something together. She hoped they meant it. She hoped Desmond had learned, in the years since their divorce, to listen indifferently. She hoped Priya knew what she was walking into, and that what she was walking into was actually good. The reception began. The room shifted into the looser, louder energy of a party finding its rhythm. Wine was poured. Speeches were given. The best man told a long story about Desmond in Whistler that got a bigger laugh than it probably deserved. Vivienne ate her salad and spoke with Clifford, who turned out to be an accountant from Kingston who was there because he'd done Priya's family's taxes for 15 years. He was a pleasant, self-contained person, and they had a perfectly decent conversation about the commercial real estate market in Eastern Ontario, which he knew more about than she expected. She didn't tell him what she did. She rarely did in rooms like this. Not out of false modesty, out of something harder to name. A preference for being known slowly. A wariness of the way a title or a figure can rearrange how a person looks at you before they've actually seen you. She was finishing her entree when she noticed the shift. It started with the servers. There was a particular server, older, silver-haired, with the bearing of someone who had worked high-end events for decades, who had been moving through the room with the practiced invisibility of his profession. At some point in the middle of the main course, he stopped. Not stopped working, stopped moving with that particular ease. He turned his head toward the entrance, a brief look. The kind of look that isn't meant to be noticeable but is. Vivienne followed his gaze. There was nothing to see yet, just the door. But she watched the room quietly shift. A junior server near the bar straightened, almost imperceptibly. The wedding coordinator, a woman in a dark blazer who had been managing the evening with calm efficiency, paused mid-conversation and looked at her earpiece. Then she said something low to her assistant and moved toward the entrance with a pace that was faster than her earlier pace but not quite hurrying. Clifford hadn't noticed any of it. Vivienne took a sip of her wine. 2 minutes later, a man walked in. He was not a large man, not physically imposing in the way that commands attention through size. He was perhaps 50, lean, wearing a suit that cost what most people spent on rent in a month, though you'd only know that if you knew. His hair was graying at the temples. He walked the way people walk when they're so accustomed to every room adjusting around them that they've stopped noticing it happening. The wedding coordinator reached him at the entrance and spoke to him quietly. He listened, nodded, and scanned the room with the unhurried attention of someone who was looking for a specific person. His gaze found Vivienne. He crossed the room toward her table. Vivienne stood. "You came," she said. "You said you might be here." Theodore Lavallee kissed her on the cheek and sat down beside her. He looked around the table, nodded to Clifford and the others with the easy courtesy of a man who is polite to everyone and intimate with almost no one. "Sorry I'm late." The call ran long. "Which call?" "Vancouver." He said it the way people say the names of cities when they mean deals, not places. Clifford had gone very still. They had been together for 14 months, she and Theodore. They had met at a private equity forum in Montreal, introduced by a mutual colleague who had said, offhandedly, "You two should know each other." They had talked for 3 hours over dinner and had barely touched their food. Theodore Lavallee was, by most measures, one of the more significant investors in Eastern Canada. The kind of figure who appears occasionally in the financial press in ways that reveal very little, whose name is mentioned in certain conversations as a reference point for how a deal might go. He was private and precise and had a dry wit that Vivienne had come to rely on in the way you rely on something, only after you realize it's become part of how you navigate the day. She had not introduced him to Desmond, not because she had planned anything, simply because their lives had not intersected and she had not gone out of her way to intersect them. Until tonight, apparently. She had not known Theodore was coming. He had texted her that afternoon, "If you're going to that thing, I'll meet you there. I have a call until 8. She had assumed the call would run later, as his calls often did. She had come alone and had expected to leave alone. She was recalibrating. The room had noticed him. Not all of it. Most of the guests were absorbed in their own conversations, their own plates, their own evening. But the people in the room who were attuned to such things, the coordinator, the senior staff, a handful of Desmond's business colleagues near the Habels had noticed. Desmond noticed. Vivienne saw the exact moment. She was not looking at him. She was listening to Theodore describe the Vancouver call, which involved a conversation she was also involved in, as their firms were co-advising on a file, but she had positioned herself in the habit she'd developed over years of rooms like this, where she could see most of the space without appearing to watch it. Desmond was standing near the bar with 2 colleagues when he looked over. The look was automatic. The kind of social scan a host does, and then it stopped. He looked at the table, he looked at Vivienne, he looked at the man sitting beside her. Something moved across his face. Not recognition at first, confusion. The particular confusion of a person encountering information that doesn't fit the model they're working from. "That's my ex-wife's table. Why is the room moving differently around my ex-wife's table?" Then recognition, then the precise, unambiguous expression of a man who has just understood something he cannot undo. His colleague said something to him. He nodded without hearing it. The toasts continued. The evening continued. Vivienne and Theodore stayed through the dinner, spoke to Clifford and the cousin from Gatineau, and the friend from Vancouver. Theodore was, as he always was, quietly excellent company, interested in people, asking questions that made people feel their answers mattered, saying very little about himself unless asked directly. When the dancing started, Vivienne set her napkin on the table and said, "We don't have to stay for this part." Theodore looked at her. "Do you want to?" She considered no. They stood. The coordinator materialized, subtly, professionally, and helped Theodore retrieve his coat with an efficiency that required no waiting. A server appeared with Vivienne's coat a moment later. She was buttoning it when Desmond appeared. He had clearly been debating whether to come over. There was a rehearsed quality to his approach, the set of his shoulders, the pace of his walk, that told her he had spent the last 20 minutes working up to this moment. She felt a kind of tired clarity looking at him. Not unkindness, just clarity. "Vivienne." He stopped a few feet away, his eyes moving to Theodore and then back. "I'm glad you came. Congratulations, Desmond. The ceremony was beautiful. Priya looked wonderful." He nodded. There was a pause that lasts longer than social comfort allows. "I didn't realize," he started. "I didn't know that you and—" "We've been together for over a year," Vivienne said, gently. Not as a correction, as a fact offered with the neutrality of something that had simply never come up because they had simply never been in a room together. Desmond absorbed this. His jaw worked slightly. Theodore extended his hand. "Felicitations on your wedding." His English was perfect, lightly accented, courteous in a way that admitted no hierarchy. Desmond shook it. He said, "Thank you. We should let you get back to your guests," Vivienne said. She touched Desmond's arm briefly, once, the gesture of someone closing a door they are glad to close. "Take care of yourself." They walked out. Outside, the October air was cold and clean, the kind of Gatineau night that smells like the park nearby. Pine and something mineral, the edge of the Gatineau River. The parking attendant brought Theodore's car around. Stars had come out over the tree line. In the car, heading back toward Ottawa on the dark parkway, Theodore was quiet for a while. Then, "How are you feeling?" Vivienne looked out at the trees moving past in the headlights. She thought about it honestly, the way she always tried to think about things. "Finished," she said. In a good way, he nodded. He understood what she meant. She thought about Desmond back in that room. The evening continuing around him, his new wife probably looking for him. The dance floor filling, the music playing. She thought about the look on his face when recognition had arrived. She didn't feel triumph. She didn't feel much of anything actually that she would call victory. What she felt was something closer to the satisfaction of a long, complicated chapter that had finally, truly reached its last page. Not because of how anyone had looked at her tonight, because of how clearly she had seen herself. 3 weeks later, Tobias set a press release on her desk. A Montreal firm had announced a major infrastructure partnership in Ontario. The details were precisely what she and Theodore had been structuring for 9 months. The announcement listed both their firms and hers was named first. She read it once, set it aside, and moved on to the next item on the agenda. Some rooms you walk out of and never look back at. Not because you've forgotten what happened in them. Because you understand, finally and fully, that everything you needed you already had when you walked in.